The scrub brush had torn Elara's knuckles raw 2 hours ago. She hadn't stopped. This was how she survived. Head down, hands bleeding, invisible. 3 years inside the palace walls, and not one guard had looked at her twice. That was the plan. That was the only plan she had left. "Maya, stay close," she murmured, without looking up. Silence answered her. Not the soft, distracted silence of a toddler inspecting a beetle. Wrong silence. The kind that falls when something enormous enters a room and the air itself holds its breath. The scent reached her a half-second too late. Mountain pine. A coming storm. Something ancient and devastating. No. No, no, no. She spun on her knees just in time to see it. Her brush clattered across the stone. Her heart stopped completely. Alphaking Silas, ruler of 7 territories, a man whose mercy was the stuff of dark legend, was not reaching for a weapon. He was laughing, soft, stunned, private. Like a man who had just seen something he didn't have the language for. Because Maya, her secret, her entire reason for breathing, had both tiny fists buried in the king's thick, dark beard, yanking it with pure toddler joy. And Silas, this armored monument of a man, had lifted her completely off the ground so they were nose to nose. His silver eyes moved slowly across the little girl's face. Something shifted in them, something cracked. Elara pressed her hand over her mouth so hard she tasted blood. He knows. He already knows. "Daddy!" Maya announced to the empty hallway, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I waited for so long." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elara had ever heard. Silas didn't move for a long time. That was the part that terrified her most. Not the guards filing in behind him, hands already drifting towards sword hilts. Not the way the torchlight caught the silver thread of his ceremonial armor. It was the stillness of him, a man who had made entire kingdoms flinch, standing frozen over a giggling 3-year-old, like she had said something that rewrote the laws of the world. Because maybe she had. "Who is this child?" His voice didn't rise. It never needed to. It simply filled everything. The vaulted ceiling, the floor, Elara's lungs, until there was no room left for anything else. Elara forced herself upright on trembling legs. "She is mine, Your Majesty." Her voice cracked. She didn't let it break. "She's only a child. She sees men in armor and she doesn't understand." Silver eyes. Silas turned his gaze on her, and it was like being stepped on. Slowly, deliberately. A maid's daughter with silver eyes. The bloodline of the Great Moon has not produced those in 4 generations, girl. "Start talking." The lords behind him shifted. Elara heard the ancient law moving through the room like cold water. Rogue wolves are outcasts. A rogue's child bearing royal blood is an abomination to be destroyed. She knew that law. She had been running from it for 3 years. Maya chose that exact moment to pat Silas on the nose. "You smell like the woods," she informed him seriously. Something crossed his face so fast Elara almost missed it. Something unbearably human. He recovered in an instant, to his jaw set like stone. "North Tower," he said quietly. "Both of them. Post 2 guards at the door and fetch High Priestess Vora." A pause. "I want a blood test at dawn. No exceptions." As the guards closed around her, Elara looked back over her shoulder. Maya was still tucked against Silas's chest, perfectly content, completely unafraid. She had no idea her mother had just run out of time. The tower smelled like old rain and iron. Elara sat with her back against the cold stone wall, Maya sleeping in her lap, and she let herself remember the thing she had spent 3 years trying to bury. The great eclipse. 3 years ago, almost to the night. She had been fleeing then too. 2 days without sleep, a hunting party 3 miles back. She had cut through the sacred wood because no sane wolf went near it during an eclipse, which meant no one would follow her. That had been the logic. She had not accounted for finding a man dying against an oak tree. He was burning with moon fever, deep in a feral shift, barely human. She had almost run. She should have run. But his hands were shaking, and his breath was coming in the shallow, stuttering rhythm of a body shutting down. And she had been raised by a healer, and some instincts simply cannot be unlearned. She had stayed. She had healed him through the night. And when the eclipse peaked, and the magic of the sacred wood moved through them both like a tide, something happened that she hadn't been able to name until it was far too late. A bond. Incomplete. Unrecognized. But real. She had left before dawn. She had never seen his face clearly. She had never known. The sound of the lock disengaging dragged her back to the present. It wasn't Silas. The woman in the doorway was tall and angular, dressed in ceremonial white, with eyes the color of old bone. High Priestess Vora. She stepped inside and pulled the door almost closed behind her, and she was smiling, the way a blade smiles just before it falls. "The king thinks he's found a daughter," Vora said softly. "How sweet, how dangerous, how convenient for you." She crouched to Elara's level, and her voice dropped to something barely above breath. "I was in those woods that night, Elara. I saw everything." The cold in the room had nothing to do with the stone walls. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Elara's arms tightened around Maya without thinking. "I've known for 3 years." Vora's smile didn't waver. "And I have spent every one of those years making sure Silas never would." She tilted her head, almost academic. "Memory suppression is a delicate art. Most practitioners are far too heavy-handed. They leave gaps, odd silences the mind keeps stumbling over. I simply replaced your face with nothing. Where you should have been, there is only fog." "Why?" The word came out raw. "What did we ever do to you?" "You!" Vora's voice sharpened. "Nothing, but a rogue queen with a legitimate heir threatens 20 years of positioning. I have spent 2 decades placing myself at the right hand of that throne." She stood, smoothing her robes. "I will not have it undone by a housemaid and her child." She moved to the door, then paused, almost as an afterthought. "The blood test tomorrow. The bowl will appear to contain the salt of truth. It won't. I've already replaced it with silver dust." Her voice was conversational, dreadful. "When that child's skin touches it, she will burn, and when the king watches his heir destroyed by a rogue's deception, there will be nothing in this world that saves you." She left. The lock clicked shut. Elara sat in the dark, her daughter's heartbeat warm and steady against her ribs, and she did not cry. Crying was a thing for people who had options. She had one, just one. She had to get Silas to break the bowl himself, without knowing why, without having a single moment alone with him, without him trusting a single word from a rogue's mouth. She stared at the ceiling until the first gray light of morning bled under the door. She still didn't have a plan. The great hall had never felt smaller. Every high lord in the kingdom had been summoned. 20 men arranged around the dais, their faces carefully neutral, the way powerful people are careful when they smell blood in the water. Guards lined the walls. Torches burned even in the morning light, as if the ceremony demanded its own darkness. Silas sat on the throne like a man who hadn't slept. He looked worse than Elara had expected, and for one traitorous second, that almost mattered to her. Maya sat on a small stool beside the throne, turning a gold coin over and over in her small hands, completely unbothered by the crowd, the swords, or the weight of centuries pressing down on the room. "Elara?" Silas's voice was quieter now, stripped of the public command. "Before this begins, I've searched the records back 4 generations. Not one rogue line carries silver eye markers. Not one." He leaned forward slightly. "If you tell me the truth right now, I will hear it. Whatever it costs me." The honesty in his voice was almost the worst part. Elara looked at Vora, standing behind the throne with the silver bowl and a saint's expression. She looked back at Silas. Every word she needed to say was stacked behind her teeth. She swallowed them. The moment she named him, Vora would push the test forward before he could stop it. This only works if he breaks the bowl himself. He has to choose to doubt Vora before Elara says a single word. "The father is a ghost," she said. Her voice barely shook. "No one you'd know." The disappointment that moved across Silas's face hit her like a fist. "Then let it begin," he said. Vora descended the dais steps like a procession of one. She moved slowly, performing for the lords, we drawing out every second. She set the bowl on the ceremonial table with both hands and stepped back, gesturing toward Maya with a priest's practiced grace. "The salt of truth does not lie," she announced. "Let the child come forward." Maya looked up from her coin. She looked at the bowl. She looked at her mother. Elara was already moving. She didn't decide to, her body simply went, and the guards caught her by both arms before she'd taken 2 steps. "Don't let her touch it." "Restrain her," Vora said calmly. Elara struggled. Her eyes locked on Maya, who had slid off the stool and was padding toward the bowl with the cheerful trust of a child who had never been given a reason to fear a room. One small hand reaching out. "Wait!" Silas's voice cut the room in half. He hadn't moved from the throne. But something had changed in his face. A narrowing of the eyes, a slight tilt of the head. He was looking at Vora. Really looking. The way a man looks at something that almost seems right, but carries one wrong note underneath it. "Why?" he said slowly. "Are you so eager?" Vora's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Your Majesty, the lords are waiting." "Vora." He stood. "Step away from my daughter." The word detonated in the room. My daughter. He hadn't meant to say it. She could see the shock of his own certainty cross his face half a second after it left his mouth. But he didn't take it back. He walked down the steps and lifted the bowl himself. He smelled it once, and went absolutely still. Silver dust. Under the salt. Enough to burn a shifter child to bone. His silver eyes found Vora's. Sianen and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. He threw the bowl at her feet. It hit the stone and shattered. The white surface dissolving instantly where it splashed, silver dust hissing black against the floor, like it was eating through the rock. Every High Lord stepped back. The guards went rigid. No one breathed. "Traitor," Silas said. Quiet. Absolute. Vora didn't flinch. She stepped over the hissing puddle with the unhurried ease of someone who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. "Look at the courtyard, Silas." Her voice had lost its performance. What was underneath was colder and older and far more dangerous. 14 High Lords and their standing armies surround your walls. I sent word 3 days ago that the king had fallen under a rogue's enchantment, so that his judgment had been compromised. A thin smile. "They believe me. They've always believed me. I have been building that trust while you were busy playing soldier." Outside, an army waited. The sound of boots and metal and the particular silence of men holding a signal. Silas looked at the window. He looked at the bowl's hissing remains. He looked at Elara, still held by the guards, knuckles still raw from the scrub brush, chin lifted like she was daring the room to finish this. Then he looked at Maya, who had retreated to her stool and was watching all of it with silver eyes, far too calm for a 3-year-old. "Your move," Vora said softly. "Give me the girl, exile the rogue, and I let your lords go home. Keep them, and this hall becomes a tomb before noon." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I choose the tomb," he said. The hall erupted, lords shouting over each other, guards moving to block every exit. The sound of the army outside growing louder as Vora lifted one pale hand toward the window. A signal, and the main gate began to give way under a battering ram. The whole building shuddered. Elara heard Maya crying. Small, frightened. That sound cut through the roar of the room like a knife through silk. 3 years. 3 years she had carried this child through freezing forests and palace shadows, through hunger and fear and 100 close calls, always outrunning, always hiding, always choosing survival over dignity. She had been invisible so long, she had almost forgotten there was something worth seeing. She was done being invisible. Something inside her went very, very quiet. The guards holding her felt it before they saw it. A shift in the quality of her stillness, the way the air around her seemed to warm and then focus like sunlight through glass. One of them loosened his grip slightly, instinctively. That was all she needed. She wrenched free. She crossed the hall in 7 steps. She pulled Maya against her chest and turned to face the groaning doors. And she breathed. "You were never just a rogue." The voice was inside her, older than memory. "You hid because you were afraid of what you carried. Stop being afraid." The light started at her hands. Soft at first. The kind of silver that looks like moonlight caught in water. It spread up her arms slowly, and the lords who were still shouting stopped, one by one, as it reached her shoulders. A few stepped back. One dropped his sword entirely. It rang against the stone, and no one looked at it. "What is—" a younger lord started. "Impossible," breathed the man beside him. His face had gone ashen, his hand pressed to his chest like a man trying to hold his heart in place. "That mark, the lunar crest. I have only ever seen it drawn in the old text." The doors burst open. 50 soldiers flooded through and stopped. Every single one of them, at the exact same moment, as if an invisible wall had risen at the threshold. Because the woman in the center of the hall was no longer entirely a woman. Elara shifted. Not like a rogue wolf, cramped and desperate, bones fighting themselves. This was something else. Something that moved through her the way a tide moves through the moon. Inevitable, enormous, ancient. When it finished, what stood in the great hall was a wolf the size of a war horse, silver-furred and luminous, the lunar crest blazing at her brow like a second sun. Every person in the room hit their knees. Not because anyone commanded it, because the instinct was older than language, older than kingdoms, older than 1,000 years of pure blood law. It lived in the marrow, and it recognized her. Even Silas went to one knee, not in submission, his eyes still fierce, his sword still drawn. But in the way a man kneels before something sacred, he didn't know he had been searching for his entire life. Only Vora remained standing, rigid, her yellow eyes wide, every trace of composure finally and completely gone. Her mouth worked silently. "A Luna of the First Age," the old lord whispered into the stunned silence. "Not seen in 1,000 years. The great moon didn't abandon us. She sent an heir." Maya, who had buried her face in the silver wolf's fur, peered out at the silent, kneeling room. She patted the enormous head beside her own, with both small hands, looking deeply satisfied. "See?" she said to no one in particular. "Mommy's special." Somewhere near the back of the hall, a soldier began to cry. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Not because it was easy, because half the army outside dropped their weapons the moment they saw the light blazing through the windows. That silver blaze every wolf in the kingdom had heard about in childhood stories, had been told was myth, had quietly, privately hoped was real. They came through the gates expecting to fight a disgraced king and a rogue maid. They found something that reached into the oldest part of them and rearranged their loyalties without asking permission. The other half, the ones whose ambitions ran deep enough to override even that, those were a harder fight. Silas fought like a man settling a debt. Elara moved beside him, shifted back to human, because this was precision work, and she fought like someone who had spent 3 years being afraid and had just decided, permanently, to stop. She moved around his guard. He covered her blind spots. They hadn't trained together for a single day, and they were devastating. Somewhere in the middle of it, between one sword block and the next, he reached back and caught her wrist for half a second. Not to pull her, just to confirm she was still there. She didn't pull away. It was over before noon. as Vora had promised, just not in the direction she'd intended. The traitor lords surrendered or fled. Vora was found behind the altar room, still in her ceremonial whites, trying to destroy a cabinet of sealed records that turned out to contain 23 years of falsified bloodline documents, suppressed binding ceremonies, and a memory poison formula the royal healers confirmed had been administered to Silas 6 separate times. 6 times. Every time his wolf had gotten close to the truth. The records were read aloud in the hall to everyone who remained. The silence afterward was different from the one at the beginning. That one had been the silence of shock. This one was the silence of reckoning, the specific quiet of people realizing how long they had believed a lie and choosing what to do with that knowledge. Silas stood in the center of the floor. His mate had been scrubbing on her knees less than 24 hours ago, and he looked at the lords still in the room. "The law of pure blood is dissolved," he said. "Effective now. Anyone who disagrees can leave my territory on foot." 3 lords left. 17 stayed. He found Elara near the broken doors, sitting on the steps with Maya asleep in her arms, exhausted, filthy, and the most important thing he had ever seen in his life. He sat down beside her without ceremony, this man who had never sat on a floor in his life, and said nothing for a long moment. "I looked for something," he said finally. "For 3 years, my wolf wouldn't settle. I didn't know what was missing. I thought it was grief." He stopped, started again. "I thought something had been taken from me, and I was simply slow to name it." Elara looked at him. "It had been." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "I know that now." Maya stirred, opened one eye, looked at Silas, and without fully waking, grabbed a fistful of his shirt. Held on. Went back to sleep. Something in his face came undone so quietly and so completely that Elara had to look away. "She knew before I did," he said, voice rougher now. "She walked up to me in that hallway, and she already knew." "She's always known," Elara said softly. "She used to point at the moon and say, 'That's Daddy's color.' I didn't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he reached over, carefully, the way you reach for something that could still shatter, and took Elara's ruined scrub brush hand in both of his. They didn't have a grand ceremony. Elara had refused. Twice. With enough force that the royal chamberlain had stopped trying and gone to sulk in the records room. She wasn't ready for thrones and silk and the formal weight of a crown on her head. She wasn't sure she'd ever be entirely ready for that. But Silas, to the considerable surprise of a court that had watched him be immovable for 20 years, didn't push. "When you're ready," he said simply. "We have time." They were in the palace garden when he said it, a week after the trial, the banishment, the dissolving of the old law. Maya was terrorizing the hedge maze at the far end of the path, her silver eyes gleaming every time she found a dead end and promptly decided it wasn't one. A guard followed her with the expression of a man who had survived wars but was finding this significantly more stressful. Elara watched her daughter dismantle centuries of careful topiary and tried to feel what she was supposed to feel. "I want you to understand something," she said, not looking at Silas. "I don't need to be queen. I don't need the title or the ceremony or the lords bowing at me in corridors." She paused. "I just need Maya to be safe. I just need to stop running. That's everything I ever wanted." "I know," Silas said. "Do you?" "I think I understand the version of you that existed last week in that tower, yes." He looked at her sideways. "I'm asking you to let me build you a different version, one that doesn't need to run." Below them, Maya emerged victorious from the maze with both arms raised, nose immediately scanning the garden for an audience. She spotted them on the bench. Her face lit with that specific, unreasonable joy she had worn every single morning since the battle. The joy of a child who had woken up to find both her parents in the same room, sharing the same breakfast, and had decided, wordlessly and permanently, that this was simply how things were now and had always been. She sprinted across the garden, She launched herself onto the bench between them without slowing down, wedged herself firmly into the gap, and looked up at both their faces with round silver eyes. "Are you fighting?" she demanded. "No," Silas said. "You look like you're figuring something out." "We are," Elara said. Maya considered this. Then she leaned back against Silas's arm, grabbed Elara's hand, and apparently decided that if they were figuring something out together, the outcome would be fine. They sat like that for a long time. The garden was warm. The maze stood partly defeated. Somewhere behind them, a court was slowly, awkwardly, stubbornly, genuinely, learning to become something it had never been before. After a while, Silas leaned down and pressed his lips to Elara's temple. Not a declaration, not a performance, just the quiet, private punctuation of a man who had spent 3 years reaching for something he couldn't name and had finally run out of reasons to reach carefully. "My queen," he said softly. An offering now, not a title. A question more than a command. Elara didn't answer right away. She looked at Maya, fast asleep between them in the afternoon sun, one hand still around her mother's fingers, the other fisted in the king's sleeve. "I told you Daddy was home," she had announced to that silent hallway, a lifetime ago, with absolute certainty, no fear, no hesitation. She'd been right, it turned out, about all of it. "Yeah," Elara said quietly. "Okay." And the new kingdom began on a garden bench, in the middle of a Wednesday, without ceremony. Which was, if you thought about it, exactly the right way. Let that garden image breathe for just a moment before this hits. You know what gets me every time I come back to this story? It's not the transformation. It's not the battle. It's not even the moment Silas smelled the bowl and chose his daughter before he'd finished choosing her. It's Maya, a 3-year-old who never doubted for a single second. While everyone around her was calculating and scheming and surviving. She just knew. She pointed at the moon and said that's Daddy's color. She walked up to the most feared king in 7 territories, grabbed his beard, and said, "I waited for you, like he was simply late coming home." Children see the truth before the rest of us have even finished building the lies. That's what this story's really about. So I want to know, which moment hit you hardest? Was it Maya in that hallway, the giggle echoing off the ceiling, while Elara's entire world came apart at the seams? Was it Silas saying my daughter before he'd even decided to, and then not taking it back? Or was it the garden at the end? No crown, no ceremony, just a Wednesday afternoon, and 2 people finally running out of reasons to be afraid? Why, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your answers shape what I write next. Now, a lot of you are going to want to know what happens to Maya. What does it look like when she steps into her power? When the daughter of a Luna and an Alphaking has to figure out who she is in a kingdom that's still learning how to be new? When the enemies her parents made don't stay gone, and the little girl who once grabbed a king's beard and called him daddy has to become something the world isn't ready for? If you want to find out, comment part 2 right now, and let me see the numbers. If this story found you at the right time, if something in Elara's exhaustion, or Silas's 3 years of reaching, or Maya's absolute certainty felt like something you needed today, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that it's okay to stop running. And if you're new here and you somehow stayed with us all the way to a garden bench on a Wednesday, subscribe. This is the kind of story I tell. There are more where this came from, and I don't want you to miss them. See you in part 2.